I paid $12. Then the slide cabinet measured wrong.
No room, no coat, no spare key, just a cracked pair of spectacles, her father's lens cloth, and $12 she had kept beneath her shoe. And with that $12, she bought a sealed stereoscope repair room behind an abandoned photography shop outside Rochester, Monroe County, New York, where county maps had stopped naming it. In 1978, the rear roof sagged 6 inches. 3 window frames had pulled from the brick. The county condemned the rooms on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Behind the rear panel of a glass slide cabinet, unopened since the trade went silent, waited money, photographs, and names that would alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Nora Vail had been aligning her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Irondequoit, she lined pennies along windowsills, straightened crooked picture frames in borrowed apartments, and watched rain divide itself on the glass. Her mother called it fussing. Nora knew only that a thing set properly seemed able to breathe again. Even at 8, she noticed when cabinet doors dragged, or when a chair stood uneven on linoleum, and she corrected what she could without being asked. Her mother, Marlene, worked double shifts at a nursing home and came home smelling of starch, coffee, and winter air. She kept receipts in a blue envelope, counted change twice, and treated silence as the safest answer whenever money entered a room. Nora learned not to ask what could not be afforded. Her father, Elias Vail, repaired stereoscopes on Saturdays at flea markets from Buffalo to Canandaigua. He carried a green baize roll containing 2 screwdrivers, a brass lens gauge, a sable brush, and the soft gray cloth Nora now kept folded in her pocket. At 6 each Saturday morning, he warmed oatmeal while she cleaned the work table with diluted vinegar, 1 part vinegar to 8 parts water, never touching the paper labels. By 9, they were beneath a canvas awning, where Elias loosened warped walnut rails with steam from a kettle, and taught her to seat paired lenses without pinching the brass rings. Nora held each viewer to the light, closed one eye, then the other, and shifted the bridge until 2 flat photographs became 1 deep room. Some showed Niagara ice. Others showed soldiers, factories, wedding parties, or children standing stiffly beside fences. People arrived carrying broken wood and left carrying distance. A picture will forgive dust but not dishonesty, Elias told her. He meant that dirt could be removed, while careless alignment made the eye accept a lie. Elias died when Nora was 17, after a winter pneumonia settled lower than anyone first understood. The rented garage holding his equipment was cleared before she could raise the overdue storage fee. Walnut viewers, box slides, gauges, awls, lens rings, and his brass work lamp disappeared into auction lots. Marlene saved only the lens cloth, found caught beneath the passenger seat of his van. 7 years later, Nora rented a narrow upstairs room for Mr. Bell, a landlord who wore wool vests even in July and spoke through doors before knocking. He inspected the stairwell twice each week, prohibited chairs on the landing, and collected rent in envelopes he marked with the time received. His building smelled of floor wax and boiled cabbage. Every rule was typed, laminated, and pinned level. When a payroll app error withheld 2 weeks of Nora's wages from the medical supply warehouse, Mr. Bell listened without looking at her face. The hallway clock ticked between them. Nora showed him the payroll message and offered to pay half immediately. He returned the telephone without reading to the end. Policies, he said, protected orderly people. On November 14, 2022, Nora returned from work to find a new brass lock where her key should have entered. Her brown suitcase sat beside the radiator, one wheel cracked, holding 2 shirts, a sweater, and 1 pair of socks. Everything else remained behind the door, including the small repair workbench she used at night. Marlene stood at the far end of the hall, with her hands inside her coat sleeves. She had driven Mr. Bell there, but would not meet Nora's eyes. "You were warned. Take this and leave tonight." 8 words. Mr. Bell placed the suitcase upright with 2 fingers, as though correcting an untidy object. Nora looked once toward her mother. Marlene pressed her lips together, then studied the illuminated fire exit sign. The elevator opened behind her. Neither of them moved to help. Nora lifted the suitcase by its side handle and carried it down 3 flights because the broken wheel struck every stair. Outside, sleet had begun collecting in the seams of the sidewalk. She set the suitcase beneath the awning and waited long enough to hear Mr. Bell's deadbolt turn. For 6 weeks, she moved through the cold edges of familiar cities. In Rochester, she slept beneath the reading room windows of the Central Library, waking whenever the security lights brightened. In Batavia, she spent $23 on one motel night until her money fell below $70. She rode to Syracuse, slept upright in the bus terminal, then returned because the shelters were full and the warehouse had stopped answering her calls. One night in Fairport, she lay behind a laundromat where the dryers warmed the brick until midnight. Another she spent in an unlocked church vestibule, shoes beneath her head, listening to salt trucks scrape Main Street. She counted what remained each morning: $58, $41, $29, $18. She stopped buying coffee. She washed in public restrooms and dried her hands on her trousers. The spectacles cracked further at the bridge, so she bound them with black thread. Whenever the knot loosened, she retied it using the tiny square knot Elias had taught her for securing a stereoscope's worn retaining cord. On December 27th, at the Rundell Memorial Library, Nora sat beside a cast-iron radiator and opened the classified pages because the heat made her fingers steady enough to turn them. Between an advertisement for a snowblower and a notice about estate lumber, 4 lines had been boxed in blue ink. County surplus. Rear commercial room. As is. Cash deed. $12. The address lay beyond the old camera district, behind a photography shop closed since 1991. A smaller line beneath it read, "Contents included. Demolition pending." Nora carried the page to the reference desk. The librarian, a narrow woman with silver beads on her eyeglass chain, checked the county parcel database and pressed one fingernail against the screen. "It's not a house," she said. "I know. There may not be water. I understand." The woman printed the parcel map without charging the usual 25 cents. Before handing it over, she circled the bus route and marked the remaining distance in pencil. Nora returned to the radiator and read the notice 3 times. Then she unfolded her father's lens cloth on the table and placed the cracked spectacles upon it. $12 would not buy a bed, a week of meals, or a train beyond the county. It could not recover her clothes or restore her name to the warehouse schedule. It could, however, purchase a deed, a room, and a door. No landlord could lock against her. She folded the advertisement along its blue border and placed it inside her coat. The $12 remained beneath the lining of her shoe, soft at the edges from 6 weeks of walking. At dawn, Nora boarded the first bus toward the county offices, carrying the broken suitcase in both hands. The bus left Rochester beneath a sky the color of old tin, carrying Nora west for 14 miles before the driver opened the door beside a shuttered feed store and pointed toward a county road. "Office is 6 miles that way." Her suitcase struck her knee as she stepped down. The wind had hardened overnight, flattening dead grass along the drainage ditch, and the temperature sign above a distant bank read 19 degrees. She walked until afternoon, stopping twice to tighten the black thread around her spectacles and once to eat half a roll saved from the library vending area. Darkness reached the fields before she found shelter. A hay barn stood back from the road with one door hanging loose enough for a person to pass sideways. Nora climbed behind stacked bales, spread her sweater beneath her shoulders, and slept among the dry smell of timothy and mouse dust. The temperature fell to 12 degrees F. Each time her feet began to ache, she sat up and rubbed them through her socks until feeling returned. At sunrise, she walked the remaining 3 miles into Mendon Center. The town occupied one patient bend in the road: Doris Bell's Cup and Saucer Cafe, Harlan Hardware with its green awning, Boyd's Funeral and Memorial Service, a barber shop called the Honed Edge, and Eastman Agricultural Repair, where 2 tractors waited behind a wire fence. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys. Someone had swept the sidewalk before the frost released it. The county clerk's annex stood inside a former savings bank with limestone columns and narrow windows. Nora pushed through the oak door, dragging her suitcase over a brass threshold worn hollow in the middle. The woman behind the counter had a white streak traveling through the center of her dark hair, exact as a painted line. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, Deputy Clerk. She was sorting deeds into shallow wooden trays and did not look up until Nora placed the classified notice beneath the glass partition. You are here, about the surplus room. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard studied Nora's coat, the cracked suitcase, and the thread holding her spectacles together. She removed the notice from beneath the glass and aligned it with the counter's edge. You understand the county guarantees no running water. Yes, ma'am. You understand the rear wall has been marked unstable. Yes, ma'am. You understand the contents have not been inventoried or insured. Yes, ma'am. You understand. Demolition authority remains active until the deed is recorded. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard leaned back. Most people ask what they are buying before they agree 4 times. I'm buying a door. The clerk's eyes rested on Nora for several seconds. Then she unlocked a lower drawer and brought out a deed packet held together with red string. The transfer required 3 signatures, 2 initials, and $12 in cash. Nora removed 1 5, 5 ones, and 2 quarters from her shoe lining, then found another dollar folded inside the lens cloth where she had forgotten placing it. Mrs. Pritchard counted the money twice and pushed 1 worn bill back. $11. And the processing waiver, she said. The advertisement was printed before the waiver. Nora did not touch the bill. The notice says 12. The notice is wrong. I'd rather the deed be right. For the first time, Mrs. Pritchard smiled. It altered only one corner of her mouth. She placed the extra dollar in the central drawer beneath a stack of receipt books, then lowered a brass recording stamp onto the deed. The mechanism struck with a clean, official weight. December 29th, 2022. Mrs. Pritchard gave directions without consulting a map. Take Route 64 north to Clover Street. Turn beside the old red pump, then follow a gravel lane past 2 walnut trees. The photography shop faces east. Your room is behind it. Entered from the south. She slid the recorded copy across the counter, but kept one finger on the surname. Vail. Nora waited. Was Elias Vail related to you, my father? The clerk's white-streaked head lifted. He repaired a viewer for my mother. Nora placed both hands on the suitcase handle. Mrs. Pritchard opened a cabinet behind her and removed a stereoscope wrapped in a square of yellowed muslin. The walnut hood had been patched along one side with a thin piece of cherry, nearly invisible, unless the light found the grain. The brass bridge carried 2 shallow tool marks. He refused payment, the clerk said. Told her the left lens had been seated backward sometime in the 1960s. She had blamed her own eyes for 20 years. That sounds like him. He worked in that rear room once. Nora looked toward the deed. Not regularly, Mrs. Pritchard continued. The owner let traveling repairmen use the bench during photograph fairs. Your father signed a maintenance ledger in 1994. I saw it when the county took possession. Is the ledger still there, if it survived the damp? The clerk rewrapped the viewer, taking care not to touch the lenses. Her hands had changed. They moved more slowly now. Your father said a stereoscope should never force the eyes to surrender. He said the instrument had to meet them halfway. Nora remembered Elias saying the same thing while shaving a warped slide rail with a narrow plane. She had forgotten the words, but not the sound of the blade. Mrs. Pritchard released the deed. Clover Street drifts badly after snow. You should reach the room before dark. Outside, the temperature had risen to 23 degrees. Nora carried the deed inside her shirt, between her sweater and the lens cloth, where wind could not take it. Route 64 climbed through open fields before entering a line of modest houses. Near Clover Street, an elderly man wearing red suspenders, split kindling beside a mailbox marked A. Keller. A black dog with one white ear watched Nora approach, but did not bark. You headed for the camera place? The man asked. Yes. He looked at her suitcase, then at the lowering sky. Dog's name is Moses. He'll follow halfway, but he knows better than to cross the creek. Moses walked beside Nora without invitation, his paws darkening the frost. Beyond the Keller property, 2 walnut trees leaned over a gravel lane, their limbs bare and deliberate. The dog stopped where water moved beneath a skin of ice. Nora thanked him. Moses sat down and watched her continue alone. The former photography shop appeared gradually through sumac and young maple growth. Its front section was built of faded red brick, approximately 22 feet wide and 40 feet deep, with a slate roof patched in 3 places by corrugated metal. A square chimney rose from the rear, missing its cap. Above the boarded storefront hung a sign whose painted letters remained visible beneath gray weathering. Hollis, Stereoscopic, and Photographic Views. Behind the shop, joined by a narrow covered passage, stood the repair room named in the deed. It measured perhaps 16 by 20 feet. The lower walls were brick, the upper portion wood-framed, and one corner had settled enough to pull the gutter loose. Snow from an earlier storm remained beneath the north eave. The south door resisted her first push. Nora set down the suitcase, placed one shoulder against the panels, and felt the swollen wood release a fraction. On the third attempt, the lower hinge groaned and the door opened inward through a ridge of dirt. Cold air came out carrying soot, wet plaster, mouse nesting, and the faint mineral odor of old photographic chemicals. Dust touched her tongue before she covered her mouth with the lens cloth. The front room held a counter, 2 stools, and a wall of shallow pigeonholes. Her boots disturbed brittle paper corners and the shells of dead beetles. A cracked prism of evening light entered through one remaining pane and struck a brass fitting beneath the counter. She moved slowly, testing each floorboard before shifting her weight. Somewhere inside the wall, water ticked at long intervals. The silence between drops was large enough to hear her coat brush the doorway. The rear room had once been the work area. 3 benches stood beneath north-facing windows. Warped stereoscope frames filled an open crate. Cracked paired lenses lay in small pasteboard boxes, each wrapped in tissue gone brown at the folds. Along the west wall rose a glass slide cabinet with 40 narrow drawers, several hanging open like tired tongues. Silvering had crept around the edges of the visible slides, turning skies dark and faces pale. Nora lifted one view by its corners. 2 photographs of the same street stood side by side, separated by less than the width of her thumb. She held them near her eyes and let the images overlap without a viewer. For one unsteady second, the road deepened. A church steeple moved backward. A horse stood forward of a storefront. 3 women in dark skirts occupied the middle distance, their faces no larger than grains of rice. Then Nora's eyes lost the alignment, and the town flattened again. She returned to the slide and searched for a place to sleep. The least damaged section of floor lay between the cold stove and the inner wall. She swept it with a hand broom found beneath the bench, spreading dust into patient gray rows. From her suitcase, she removed the sweater, 1 shirt, and the folded county map, laying cardboard drawers beneath them for insulation. Night entered before she finished. The stove held no wood, and the chimney had not been inspected, so she did not risk a fire. She ate the remaining half roll, drank water from a library bottle, and kept her shoes on. The cold found the gaps beneath the door and traveled close to the floor. From where she lay, Nora could see the glass slide cabinet in the final blue light. 1 drawer remained slightly open near the bottom. Behind its glass front waited the blurred outline of a family standing beside a wooden house, each person fixed in place by an exposure made long before anyone living had spoken Nora's name. She folded the deed beneath her cheek and listened until the building's small sounds separated themselves. Timber easing, ice forming in the gutter, a loose lens ring shifting somewhere on the bench. Some rooms keep what the town forgets. Nora spent the first morning finding out what still worked. The hand pump behind the photography shop produced rust-colored water for 12 strokes, then cleared enough to fill a white enamel basin. The outhouse stood 40 yards beyond the walnut trees, tilted but usable, with a crescent cut into its door, and snow gathered across the seat. Inside the repair room, she learned which floorboards announced her weight and which held silence. The 3rd plank beside the stove clicked twice. The board beneath that north bench gave 1 long complaint. Near the glass slide cabinet, the floor stayed firm. By the 3rd day, hunger had sharpened every smell in town. Nora walked back to Harlan Hardware, carrying the empty basin and the $1 Mrs. Pritchard had returned. The store was narrow and deep, warmed by a coal stove whose pipe traveled through 2 floors. Nails, hinges, rope, and stovepipe elbows occupied drawers blackened by decades of hands. The owner, Silas Harlan, had 1 eyebrow entirely white and used it like punctuation. He stood behind the counter repairing the wooden handle of a garden fork. "You bought the Hollis room," he said. Nora set the basin down. "News travels. Bad roofs travel faster." She showed him the county deed and asked for the least expensive supplies necessary to make the chimney safe. Silas wrote figures on a paper sack. A 6-inch wire chimney brush cost $4.80. 25 feet of jointed fiberglass rod cost $6.25. A flat stove scraper was $1.10. 2 pounds of refractory patch cost $2.40. A box of long kitchen matches cost 35 cents. Nora looked at the total, then at her $1. "I can work the balance off. I don't hire. I can sweep, stack, carry, clean windows." Silas's white eyebrow rose. "I pay what I owe," she said. He tore the figures from the sack and opened a red account book whose pages had softened at the corners. Under Vail, Nora, he entered $14.90, then drew 1 exact line beneath it. 30 days. Yes, sir. No interest unless you vanish. I won't. From under the counter, he brought out a stained manual titled Repairs for the Rural Homeowner, 1948 edition. The spine had been mended with cloth tape. "Free," he said. "Nobody should charge for instructions that may keep a roof from burning." Nora read the chimney chapter at the cafe over a bowl of bean soup Doris placed before her, without asking. The procedure was simple, only on paper. Inspect the flue, seal the stove opening, brush from the top, collect the fall, repeat until the soot diminished, the room's chimney lacked a cap, and the roof edge above it was soft with rot. She began from below. Nora disconnected the stovepipe and covered the opening with damp sacking tied by cord. She inserted the brush upward 1 rod at a time, turning clockwise so the threaded joints could not loosen inside the flue. At 6 feet, the brush stopped. She pulled down a fist-sized crust of creosote, black and shining like cooled tar. The second obstruction broke after 40 minutes of short upward strokes. Soot spilled behind the sacking and found every gap in her sleeves. She worked until her palms blistered beneath borrowed canvas gloves, adding rods until the brush reached daylight. Then she withdrew it slowly, scraping each section clean with the flat tool before unscrewing it. The first pass produced almost 3 gallons of soot, mortar crumbs, and a bird's nest containing 2 pale fragments of shell. The second produced half as much. On the third, the bristles returned gray rather than black. 6 hours had passed. Nora shone a flashlight upward through a pocket mirror. The flue walls were rough, but open, and no light escaped through the masonry into the room. She patched 2 shallow gaps with refractory compound, pressing it into the joints with the rounded back of a spoon. Then she waited until morning. For the first fire, she used 3 split sticks from Mr. Keller's woodpile, delivered without explanation beside the south door. Nora opened the damper fully, twisted newspaper beneath the kindling, and held 1 long match to the paper. Smoke curled into the room, hesitated, then climbed through the pipe. The draft caught. Flame moved upward with a dry, careful sound. Nora fed it 1 stick at a time and watched the patched joints for smoke. None appeared. The iron stove warmed unevenly, first at the collar, then across the top plate. She set the enamel basin upon it with water, half an onion, a potato, and a spoonful of salt from Doris's paper packet. The meal took 40 minutes. She ate sitting on the floor, holding the basin between her knees. The potato remained hard at the center, and the onion had nearly vanished. But steam clouded her spectacles, and for the first time since November, she removed her coat indoors. Afterward, she began the workroom inventory. She chose only what could be saved. There were 6 walnut stereoscope hoods with sound joinery, though 2 had split handles. A brass lens centering gauge lay beneath a felt pad, its engraved measurements still legible. 3 paired achromatic lenses remained unbroken inside a drawer marked 234-inch focus. A narrow shoulder plane had rusted along one cheek but retained its edge. There was a box of blackened brass retaining rings, a spool of waxed linen thread, and a sable brush sealed inside a glass tube. The slide cabinet dominated the west wall. Its 40 drawers were shallow enough for glass views laid flat in paper sleeves. Most contained town scenes: the mill race in winter, workers outside a shoe factory, children beside a schoolhouse, a funeral procession on Clover Street. Silver migration had darkened the margins, but the central images remained clear. Nora handled each slide by the edges. She used no water. Elias had taught her that moisture could travel beneath cracked emulsion and lift a face from its glass. Loose dust came away with the sable brush. Finger marks on the plain side yielded to a barely damp cloth, followed immediately by dry cotton. Near evening, she reached the lowest drawer. It resisted. Nora pulled again, supporting the front with her other hand. The drawer moved 2 inches and stopped against something behind it. She removed the slides, then tried once more. The empty drawer still would not travel its full depth. She tapped the side of the cabinet with the wooden handle of the brush. The upper section answered with a thin, open knock. The lower rear gave back a short, dense sound. Nora moved to the adjoining drawer and repeated the test. Open above, dense below. She measured the cabinet from front to wall, 24 inches. The drawer interior measured only 18 3/4. There should have been 5 inches of empty space. She knelt and pressed against the cabinet's rear panel from inside the lowest compartment. It did not flex. When she lifted the cabinet's front edge with a pry bar, the lower half remained unexpectedly heavy after the drawers had been removed. At the back of the compartment, beneath a strip of black felt, her fingertip found a circular indentation. She peeled the felt slowly and uncovered a cedar disc no larger than a quarter, fitted flush into the wood. 2 small holes had been drilled near its center. Nora bent a length of brass wire into a narrow U, inserted the ends, and turned. The disc rotated 1/4 turn. Something released behind the panel with a wooden click. She did not pull immediately. She cleared the bench, lit the brass work lamp with stove-warmed oil, and placed Elias's lens cloth beneath her tools. Then she eased a thin putty knife along the panel seam until the lower edge came forward. Cold, dry air escaped. Inside stood 4 packages wrapped in waxed paper and tied with faded blue cord. A flat wooden case occupied the bottom. Beside it sat a rectangular tin box, dull with age but free of rust. Nora removed the first package with both hands. It contained a matched set of lens spanners, each tip ground to a different width, and a small brass jig for aligning paired lenses. The handles bore initials cut by hand. AV the second held 12 prepared walnut rails, wrapped separately so they had not warped. The third contained circles of optical glass divided by tissue and marked with focal lengths in pencil. The fourth held labels, linen tape, black sealing paper, and 2 unopened packets of jeweler's rouge. The flat case contained town photographs. Not commercial views, but portraits made outdoors and labeled in dark brown ink. Families stood beside boarding houses, laundry yards, church steps, and factory gates. Their names were written beneath the images. Anton and Lydia Krawiecz, 1906. Samira Haddad, with daughters, 1911. Pietro and Rosa Bellini, North Water Street. The Wong family behind the laundry, 1913. Several labels carried the same second notation. Omitted from register. Nora set the case aside. The tin box had been sealed with a cloth strip and red wax. She warmed a knife over the stove and softened the wax without cutting the fabric. Beneath the lid lay currency wrapped in newspaper, coins divided among small cotton bags, and 1 envelope addressed only to whoever opens this room. She left the envelope closed. The paper money had been arranged by denomination and tied in bundles. Nora counted each bundle twice, writing the totals in the blank rear pages of the repair manual. The coins required longer. There were Morgan silver dollars, Barber half dollars, Indian head cents, and $20 St. Gaudens gold pieces wrapped individually in tissue. One bag contained a Purple Heart dated 1944, its ribbon folded behind the metal, and its reverse engraved with the name Thomas Avery Vail. Nora's hands stopped. The surname matched her own. She placed the metal apart from the money and continued counting because exactness was the only steady ground left. Midnight passed. The fire settled to red seams beneath gray ash. She counted the final currency bundle a third time. $39,760. She wrote the figure once, then checked every column again. The amount did not change. Nora returned the money to the tin box, preserving the order in which she had found it. She wrapped the metal in Elias's lens cloth and placed the unopened envelope on top. The labeled photographs remained across the bench, faces turned upward beneath the lamp. She could have opened the letter. Instead, she carried the basin outside and walked beyond the walnut trees to the creek. Ice covered the shallows, but black water moved through the center, reflecting 1 star at a time. She stood there until the cold entered her sleeves, and the repair room lamp became a small amber square behind her. Some rooms keep what the town forgets. Morning entered through the north windows in a pale band and found Nora still wearing yesterday's clothes. The envelope waited where she had left it, its paper cream-colored beneath a film of dust. When she lifted it, the handwriting caught her before the words did. The capital V leaned forward, the lower loops closed tightly. Elias had written his name that way, but these lines were older, steadier, and made by another hand in the same family. Nora sat at the bench, placed the metal to her left, and opened the envelope along its softened edge. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the rear cabinet has been opened, and the room has outlived my ability to protect it. My name is Adelaide Miriam Vail. In March of 1951, Dr. Samuel Rosen at Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester told me that the weakness in my hands came from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He spoke plainly. I asked him how long I might continue fine work. He said perhaps a year, perhaps less. The Vails entered this trade through my great-grandfather, Abel Vail, born in 1828 in Seneca Falls, who ground spectacle lenses in Albany after the canal work failed him. His son Josiah, born in 1854, moved to Rochester and began fitting stereoscope lenses in 1879. Josiah's daughter Miriam, my mother, was born in 1878 and repaired viewers from this room until influenza took her in 1919. I was born here in 1898 and kept the benches after her. 4 generations, and each learned by holding the damaged thing gently enough to understand where it had yielded. The trade closed on October 17, 1951. The town believes the room became storage. For more than 30 years, silence was safer than correction. My brother Thomas Avery Vail served with the 29th Infantry Division and was killed in France during the Second World War. The metal in the box was sent home after his death. Keep it with his name. You will also find photographs I was told not to catalog. The families came from Poland, Syria, Italy, China, and other places our public record preferred not to see. Their portraits were paid for. Their names were written. Then certain men ordered the glass views removed from the official register because they said the town's history should look more respectable. I kept them. If you mean to work here, remember these measures. Warm, warped walnut over steam for no more than 90 seconds. Then clamp it between flat boards for 12 hours. Clean the glass side with 1 part alcohol to 4 parts distilled water, never the emulsion side. Set paired lenses at equal depth within 1/32 of an inch. Test focal distance at 17 inches before tightening the rings. If the eyes strain, the work is not honest yet. The money came from repairs, photographs, and the sale of my father's land. Use it slowly. An inheritance is not what sits untouched in a box. It is the work you are willing to continue without claiming you invented it. Behind the room, beyond the walnut roots, you will find Thomas's stone marker near the creek. Light the brass lamp for him once. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Adelaide Miriam Vail, October 17, 1951. Nora read the letter a second time without moving the metal. On the 3rd page, Adelaide's pen had pressed harder where Thomas's name appeared, leaving a shallow groove visible from the reverse. Nora traced nothing. She returned each sheet to its original fold, following the pale creases until the envelope became flat and closed again. Outside, the snow had hardened enough to support her first few steps. She walked behind the repair room, past the pump, and through the walnut shadows, following the creek until one root rose like a dark knuckle from the bank. The marker lay beneath it. Years of leaf mold covered the upper half. Nora cleared the stone with her gloves and found a carved cross, a surname, and a date. Thomas Avery, Vail 1921 to 1944, no county flag marked the place. No flowers remained beneath the snow. At the base of the stone, a small relief showed 2 stereoscope lenses joined by a bridge, the same shape cut into the brass jig from the cabinet. Nora brushed the letters until each one held daylight. Back inside, she filled the old brass lamp with the last of the stove oil. Its wick had hardened, so she trimmed away the black edge and raised a clean 1/4 inch through the burner. The first match failed. The second produced a low blue line before the flame settled gold. She placed the lamp beside the Purple Heart. Its light crossed the cabinet doors and entered the photographs, catching cheeks, collars, and the white corners of houses whose street numbers had vanished. The room did not become warmer, but its shadows withdrew. That afternoon, Nora carried the borrowed chimney rods back to Harlan Hardware. Silas closed the red account book after she promised to sweep the stockroom twice each week. Doris met her outside the cafe and pressed 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper into her palm. Mr. Keller left a dry split of maple beside the lane, while Moses waited until Nora picked it up before turning home. Mrs. Pritchard had given her a lawful door. The librarian with silver beads had given her a map and 1 printed page. None of them had solved her life. Each had moved 1 small weight. Before this story goes further, think of 1 small kindness someone once gave you when they did not have to. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a key, or simply a name spoken without judgment. Tell us about it in the comments. Quiet help is often the part worth remembering. That night, Nora slid the tin box beneath the bench and kept the photographs inside the cabinet, arranged exactly as Adelaide had left them. She placed the brass jig, the medal, and the folded letter beside her blanket. The lamp burned until its flame shortened, and Nora slept with 4 generations of careful work within reach. On December 3rd, 6 inches of snow covered the gravel lane and laid a white edge along the sagging roof. Nora stood beneath the south eave with the 1948 repair manual open against her coat and read the roofing chapter 3 times, once for sequence, once for measurements, and once for every place a mistake could admit water. The roof measured 16 by 22 feet on each slope. Allowing 10% for breakage and cuts, she calculated 900 cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 12 pounds of hot-dipped nails. She wrote the figures in pencil on a cabinet label, then carried them to Harlan Hardware. Silas checked the arithmetic without praise. From beneath a shelf, he took a roofing hatchet with a square face, a leather-wrapped handle, and a notch for pulling nails. "My brother used this," he said. "He's been gone 11 years. Nora held it by the head rather than the handle. "I'll return it. Return it sharp." The skilled hands arrived the next morning in the person of Amos Keller, Moses's owner, who had roofed houses for 38 years before his knees forced him down from ladders. He wore the same red suspenders and carried a chalk box, polished smooth by use. "I can't pay you," Nora said. "Didn't ask." He refused coffee, money, and the chair she offered. Instead, he climbed the ladder, pressed 1 thumb against the soft rafter near the chimney, and told her where to begin. They removed the failed metal patches and found 1 rafter split nearly 4 feet along the grain. Nora cut a sister rafter from straight pine, coated the adjoining faces with construction adhesive, and fastened the new timber beside the old with staggered carriage bolts. Amos made her tighten each nut until the washers seated without crushing the wood. They stretched felt from eave to ridge, overlapping every course 4 inches. Amos snapped a chalk line across the first row of shingles and taught Nora to drive each nail with 3 strokes, 1 to start, 1 to seat, and 1 lighter stroke to finish flush. Her first afternoon, he stopped beside a crooked course. "That nail's proud. Set it again." Nora placed the hatchet beneath the head. "Pull it. The angle is wrong." They worked for 11 days. Snow melted beneath their boots during the warmer hours and froze again at dusk. Nora learned to leave a 1/4 inch gap between shingles, offset joints by at least 1.5 inches, and feel for the chalk line through her gloves. Amos spoke only when the roof required it. On December 15th, they fixed the final ridge cap. Nora climbed down after dark, shoulders trembling from effort. Amos remained in the lane, looking upward while snow began to gather on the new cedar. "That'll shed weather," he said. It was the closest he came to approval. January entered through the chimney. The exterior bricks above the roofline had begun to spall, their fired faces peeling away in thin red plates. Inside the repair room, powdered mortar collected behind the stove each time the wind pressed against the building. Nora could rub one joint into sand with her thumb. She borrowed a masonry chisel, removed the loose mortar to a depth of 3/4 of an inch, and brushed each channel clean. Silas advised a mix of 3 parts washed sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 1 part fire clay near the flue. Portland cement, he warned, would cure too hard and break the older brick around it. For 3 weeks, Nora worked in temperatures that seldom rose above the 20s. She soaked the joints lightly before packing them, pressed mortar in 2 thin lifts, and shaped each seam with a rounded jointer after the surface lost its shine. Every 15 minutes her bare fingers went numb, forcing her to place both hands beneath her arms until pain returned in sharp pulses. The upper courses required replacement bricks salvaged from the collapsed rear wall of Eastman Agricultural Repair. Their dimensions matched within 1/8 of an inch. Nora cleaned off the old mortar, set each brick on a full bed, and checked the flue opening with a weighted line so no inward bulge could narrow the draft. Near the stove collar, she found a crack hidden beneath soot. She removed the damaged mortar and filled the joint with the lime fire clay mixture, pressing it deep with a narrow pointing iron. Then she waited 7 days before heating it. On January 28th, Amos stood outside while Nora lit the test fire. She warmed the chimney first with a rolled sheet of newspaper held beneath the open damper, then added dry pine and 1 maple split. Smoke entered the flue without hesitation. Amos watched the chimney top. A gray ribbon rose straight into the winter air, clean and unbroken. Inside, Nora passed her hand near every repaired seam. No smoke touched her skin. The floor work began 3 days later. Beneath the dirt and old finish, the workroom held white pine planks fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. Several boards were cupped, but only 2 had rotted through. Nora lifted those carefully, copied their widths, and replaced them with salvaged pine from a dismantled pantry wall. She rented a random orbit sander from Silas for $14 per day. The machine was heavier than it appeared and pulled forward whenever the disc caught an uneven edge. She set every proud nail by hand, then made 3 complete passes: 80 grit to remove the blackened finish, 120 to close the coarse scratches, and 220 for the final smoothing. Dust entered the cuffs of her shirt and settled along her hairline. Nora vacuumed between every pass and wiped the boards with a dry tack cloth. Never water. The room brightened by degrees, plank after plank, until the grain that had been hidden for decades returned beneath her hands. She applied the first oil coat with a folded lint-free cloth, working in the direction of the boards and removing every wet patch after 20 minutes. The second coat went down the following evening. The third was thinner and absorbed slowly. She closed the room for a 48-hour cure and slept in the front shop beside the cold counter. The board shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, deepening where old feet had compressed the grain. Under the north windows, faint marks from stools remained visible. Nora left them. One February morning, she entered with sandpaper in her pocket and could not begin. The stove had gone out. Her breakfast remained untouched. She walked to the marsh beyond Clover Street and stood among frozen cattails until a great blue heron descended beside an opening in the ice. The bird waited without moving, its narrow body gray against the reeds. Nora watched it for more than an hour. When it lifted, the The wings unfolded with no visible hurry. She did no work that day. By February 4th, the floor had cured. Nora carried the benches back one at a time and placed their feet over the pale impressions where they had stood before. The 8 windows required a different patience. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes kept together by dirt and brittle putty. The 8th contained one original pane dated in a scratched corner, 1788. Its surface wavered with hand-drawn imperfections, bending the walnut branches beyond it into slow, uneven lines. Nora preserved that pane in place. She removed the damaged glass by warming the old putty with a low heat gun and lifting it in fragments with a narrow knife. After pulling the glazing points, she cleaned each rabbet, brushed on linseed oil, and allowed the dry wood to absorb it before bedding the replacement panes. Silas sold her Dapey 33 glazing putty on credit. Nora rolled it between her palms into a rope, pressed it firmly against the glass, and drew the putty knife in one continuous stroke, keeping the bevel narrow enough that no compound showed from inside. Her first corner tore, the second sagged. By the 4th window, the line held clean from muntin to sill. Several sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Nora replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, lowering each iron counterweight until it rested at the bottom. She tied a figure-8 knot through the weight's eye, pulled it tight, then raised the sash to test its balance. One cord slipped free and vanished into the wall. She opened the pocket again and repeated the work without speaking. The original 1788 pane received only new points and a thin protective edge of putty. Nora cleaned it with distilled water on the room side, keeping the cloth away from the scratched date. At the last window, she raised the repaired lower sash and felt it remain precisely where she released it. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch no thicker than Nora's finger. Its feet closed around the wood, and its black cap turned toward the room. Nora rested her hand on the sash cord. The bird remained until she lowered the window, then crossed the white yard in one quick line. By late February, the walls had begun shedding their oldest repairs. The original plaster was horsehair, mixed over hand-split oak lath, each narrow strip carrying hatchet marks beneath the lime. Nora's first 3 patches beside the chimney failed. One cracked from drying too quickly. One sagged between the laths. The 3rd released whole when she touched its edge the following morning. Silas brought an old burlap bag from his loft containing horsehair, saved by his father. "Use less water," he said. Nora mixed fresh lime plaster, teased the hair apart with gloved fingers, and pressed a scored scratch coat through the gaps until it curled behind the oak. She added a 3/8-inch brown coat, leveled it with a straight edge, and let it cure beneath damp cloths for 72 hours. The finished coat measured 1/8 of an inch, smooth, but not polished enough to hide the older wall. When the final patch hardened, its pale edge met the 1951 plaster without pretending to be the same age. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was a broad-shouldered woman with flour caught permanently in the seam of her wedding ring, though she had been widowed nearly a decade. The bags contained heel ends of bread, soup in covered jars, and once 2 slices of apple cake wrapped in butcher paper. Nora carried an empty jar back to the cafe. "I need to pay you." Doris wiped the counter with one hand and pushed the jar toward the kitchen with the other. In Candles, when the shop reopens, the matter was closed. Caleb Price arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, all wrists and elbows, with one front tooth chipped into a neat white angle. Without introducing himself, he began dividing the maple rounds Amos had left beside the lane. Nora came outside carrying gloves. "I can't pay for labor." Caleb set another round on the block. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He swung the maul before she could ask what his mother had said. The steel entered the wood squarely, and the split fell into two honest halves. He worked until noon, stacked every piece beneath the eave, then rode away with one trouser cuff tied by string. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk between the parsonage and the church. He was a narrow man with polished boots and an auburn beard turning silver beneath the chin. He never entered unless invited. He only stopped at the lane, tipped his hat, and raised two fingers toward the roof. Keep her through winter. The prayer remained 4 words. Nora postponed the cellar until February 11th, when the ground softened enough for the outer doors to open without a pickaxe. 7 granite steps descended beneath the front shop. The 3rd step had dropped at one corner, while the bottom rested on a fieldstone floor, 12 feet wide and 15 feet long. The cellar smelled of mineral damp, apples long gone, and cold iron. At its center lay a dressed granite slab, narrower than a grave marker, and fitted level among rough stones. A carved symbol occupied one corner, 2 circles joined by a short bridge, the same stereoscope mark cut into Adelaide's brass jig and Thomas's marker. Nora brushed the channels clean. She did not lift the slab. A collapsed shelf had spilled canning jars along the east wall. While removing them, she found a small oak box wedged beneath the 3rd granite step. It had no lock and opened on a single wooden hinge. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into the joined circles of a stereoscope, each ring no larger than Nora's thumbnail. Beneath it rested a tintype wrapped in cotton. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the cottage in the summer of 1903, a lens spanner in one hand, and a stereoscope hood beneath the other arm. She had Nora's narrow chin, uneven eyebrows, and the same slight inward turn of the left foot. On the back, scratched through the black varnish, were the words Miriam Vail, daughter of Josiah, age 25, summer of 1903. Nora carried the tintype upstairs and placed it beside Adelaide's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel above the stove. She tried it in the cabinet, the front door, the desk drawers, and the tin box. It opened nothing. By March, snow withdrew from the south wall in dark crescents. The creak grew loud enough to hear from the workbench, and the walnut trees released long, green catkins that tapped the repaired windows during wind. Nora did not begin full stereoscope work that spring. She cleaned the surviving tools, copied Adelaide's measurements, and ordered only enough material for small trials. From the cache, she selected one worn Morgan dollar, recorded its date and value, and exchanged it for walnut offcuts, 2 plain lenses, linen tape, and black paper. She practiced cutting rails square. She steamed warped scraps for 90 seconds, clamped them 12 hours, and rejected every pair that forced her eyes to strain. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 18, 2024, Nora completed her first stereoscope. The hood was walnut taken from a fallen branch Amos had saved beneath his barn roof. She planed the rails by hand, cut the slide channel one careful pass at a time, and seated 2 matched lenses within 1/32 of an inch. The handle followed the slight curve of Miriam's tool in the tintype. Nora placed one of Adelaide's duplicated town views into the holder and adjusted the focal distance to 17 inches. Through the lenses, Clover Street deepened. Snow lay before the old shoe factory. A boy stood beside a barrel. Behind him, Samira Haddad and her daughters occupied the photograph's right edge, where a later catalog had omitted their names. The image did not strain. Nora loosened one retaining ring, shifted the right lens by less than a thread's width, and tightened it again. When she looked once more, the women stood with the same quiet solidity as the buildings. Only then did she mark the viewer complete. The restored repair room held no unnecessary brightness. White pine floors carried the deep color of old honey. The 8 windows opened without argument. Benches stood beneath clean north light, and Adelaide's brass lamp rested beside the lens gauge. Nora kept the patched plaster visible. Beside the stove, the three failed places had become one pale, durable field. The brass key waited on the mantel until January. A hard wind had broken one lower limb from the eastern walnut tree. While trimming the torn wood, Nora noticed a narrow, brass plate set into the trunk's oldest scar, nearly concealed by bark that had grown around its edges. The plate carried the stereoscope mark. She fetched the key. Its bow fit between her fingers as though made for that motion. The lock resisted once, then turned with a low internal click. A shallow, copper-lined compartment opened behind the plate, protected from rain by the overhanging scar. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, its cotton dry but browned along the creases. Beneath it rested a note sealed in waxed cloth. The handwriting belonged to Miriam. July 14th, 1918, Josiah says, "The war will end before this tree bears another heavy crop. But the casualty lists have taught us not to bargain with seasons. I have placed this flag here for whichever child returns, and for whichever does not." Our neighbors from North Water Street have sons in France, though the town clerk still misspells their names. I photographed each family yesterday. A record must be exact before it can be honorable. If this tree keeps the cloth longer than I live, let the finder carry every name forward, not only ours. Nora read the note beneath the bare branches, holding the flag against her coat. The tree had thickened around the compartment for more than a century without sealing it shut. She returned the note and flag to the room, wrapped them in acid-free tissue, and built a shallow walnut case for the wall. Miriam's tintype went beside it. No label called them relics. Nora wrote only the names and dates. On June 6, 2025, the 81st anniversary of the Normandy landings, Nora carried Thomas Avery Vail's Purple Heart to Whitehaven Memorial Park in Pittsford. A cemetery archivist confirmed his division and added a copy of Adelaide's letter to the burial record. Nora stood beside his marker after the archivist left. She laid no wreath. She cleaned the engraved letters with a soft brush, placed one small town photograph beneath a stone for the afternoon, and took it home before rain. The money remained largely untouched. Nora used 3 Morgan dollars and 1 Barber $half during the first 2 years, exchanging them only after photographing both faces and entering each date in Adelaide's ledger. They purchased optical glass, walnut, archival sleeves, and a used magnifying lamp. The remaining coins, bills, and gold pieces went back into the tin box. Nora added a new cotton packet containing receipts and a written account of every amount used. Across the top page she wrote, "For the next one." She returned to the box behind the cabinet panel and reset the cedar disc. The hiding place no longer belonged to secrecy. It belonged to restraint. The shop reopened without a sign in the window. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a church supper notice and an advertisement for snowplow repair. Stereoscope viewers repaired glass views, cleaned and cataloged in. Vail, Clover Street, the first customer brought a viewer whose bridge had been tightened until the walnut cracked. The second carried 12 family slides and a biscuit tin. By summer, Nora had a mailing list of 43 names written on ruled cards, most from western New York and northern Pennsylvania. She accepted only the work she could finish carefully. Some weeks that meant 2 viewers. Some weeks, none. Caleb returned after finishing high school. He arrived in an old pickup with the blue Schwinn tied behind the cab and a long object wrapped in a wool blanket. He had grown broader through the shoulders, though the chipped front tooth remained. Without ceremony, he leaned the object against the workbench and removed the blanket. It was a hand-carved walnut sign. Vail Stereoscope Repair and Daughters. Nora read the final line twice. I don't have daughters. Caleb rubbed sawdust from the carved ampersand with his thumb. Neither did the sign. Not yet. He had copied the lettering from a 1903 photograph, preserving the uneven width of Josiah's original capitals. The words in daughters were newer, cut deeper, and left without stain so the walnut would darken around them slowly. Nora ran one finger inside the finals. Your spelling is straight. My mother checked. They hung the sign beneath the covered passage, where rain could not strike it directly. Caleb stepped back, judged the left chain, and moved it one link higher. Nora did not correct him. That December, she began her own letter. She used Adelaide's workbench, Elias's lens cloth beneath her wrist, and paper from the same Rochester mill that had made the archival sleeves. She wrote the date first, then paused until the stove settled into a quiet red heat. My dear one, whoever you are. She described the roof, the repaired chimney, and the 1788 pane still holding its small scratched date. She listed the names restored from the slides and explained where duplicate records had been deposited. She recorded the location of Thomas's medal and Miriam's note. Then she wrote the practical measures. Do not steam the walnut longer because you are impatient. Do not clean the image side because the dirt troubles you. Do not tighten a lens until the eye must surrender. Leave the marks of earlier hands where they do no harm. She told the next keeper about Doris's bags, Silas's red ledger, Amos's roofing hatchet, Caleb's sign, and Reverend Boyd's four-word prayer. She did not call these debts. She called them instructions for living in a place that had been kept by more people than any deed could name. Some rooms keep what the town forgets. Nora folded the letter along 3 exact creases and placed it inside a fresh envelope. She did not hide it behind the cabinet. She set it in the upper drawer beside the maintenance ledger, where a working hand would find it before money. Snow began after dark. Nora extinguished the brass lamp, checked the stove damper, and stood for a moment beneath the sign Caleb had carved. The walnut letters were darkening unevenly, old words and new words finding one color. The Stereoscope repair room waits. It has always waited. At the county clerk's annex, Mrs. Pritchard retired the following spring. While emptying her central drawer, she found the worn dollar Nora had refused to take back on the day of the deed. She placed it beneath the new clerk's receipt books, with a note explaining nothing. The bill remains there.